He worked miracles with nothing but rust-stained wrenches and a prayer, turning scrap metal into running dreams while his young son watched from the corner of their crumbling garage. Ethan White had lost everything, his wife, his savings, his hope, but he refused to let his boy see him quit. Then one scorching afternoon, a sleek black sedan rolled into his dusty lot, steam rising from under the hood like a distress signal. The woman who stepped out looked like she'd never touched anything dirtier than silk, but her eyes held secrets that would shatter everything he thought he knew about second chances. What happened next didn't just fix her car, it rebuilt his entire world. If you believe in the power of hidden angels and the magic that happens when broken souls find each other, stay with us. And if stories of impossible transformation speak to your heart, consider subscribing for more journeys that prove miracles still happen in the most unexpected places. Ready to witness how rusty tools and a billionaire's secret changed one father's destiny forever? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The summer heat in Copper Creek hit like a furnace door swinging open, and Ethan White wiped the sweat from his forehead with the back of his grease-stained hand as he stared at the eviction notice tacked to the weathered door of White's Auto Repair. 3 days. That's all he had left before the bank would chain the doors shut on everything he and Sarah had built together. The garage sat on the outskirts of town like a forgotten memory, its tin roof sagging under the weight of too many storms and not enough repairs. Paint peeled from the sides in long, curling strips that fluttered in the desert wind, and the neon open sign in the window had been broken for so long that most folks just assumed the place was abandoned. But inside those walls, magic still happened daily, the kind of magic that turned dying engines into purring cats and gave hope to anyone whose transportation had given up the fight. Ethan crumpled the notice and shoved it deep into his pocket, where it joined the disconnect warnings from the electric company and the final notice from his son's school about unpaid lunch fees. At 34, he looked older than his years, his dark hair showing premature gray at the temples, and his brown eyes carrying the weight of a man who'd buried his dreams alongside his wife 2 years ago. But his hands, those were the hands of an artist, scarred from countless burns and cuts, permanently stained with oil that no amount of scrubbing could remove. They could coax life from the most hopeless mechanical situations. "Dad?" The voice came from the corner of the garage where 9-year-old Tyler White sat cross-legged on a milk crate, carefully sorting bolts by size into baby food jars that Sarah had saved from Tyler's early years. The boy had his mother's bright green eyes and stubborn chin, but his father's gentle way of handling broken things. Mrs. Patterson called again about the rent. Ethan's chest tightened. Tyler wasn't supposed to worry about these things, wasn't supposed to know that they were living paycheck to paycheck in the tiny apartment above the garage, eating peanut butter sandwiches for dinner more often than not. But 9-year-olds notice everything, especially when their world is held together with duct tape and prayer. "I'll handle Mrs. Patterson, buddy," Ethan said, forcing his voice to stay steady. "You just focus on getting those bolts organized. Think you can make them shine like your mom used to?" Tyler's face lit up at the mention of Sarah. She'd been the heart of this place, the one who could sweet-talk angry customers and make the books balance even when the math seemed impossible. More than that, she'd been the dreamer who convinced Ethan that their little garage could be something special, a place where people didn't just get their cars fixed, but where they felt heard and valued and cared for. The morning dragged on, with its usual rhythm of small defeats and smaller victories. Ethan managed to get Mrs. Chun's ancient Honda to pass inspection by fashioning a makeshift exhaust pipe from spare parts he'd been saving for emergencies. He charged her half what any other shop would have asked, partly because he knew she was struggling too, and partly because he couldn't bring himself to profit from someone else's desperation. By noon, the temperature outside had climbed past 90, and the garage felt like the inside of an oven. The ancient box fan in the corner wheezed and rattled, moving the hot air around without really cooling anything. Ethan had stripped down to a tank top that had seen better days, and even Tyler had abandoned his usual long sleeves for a t-shirt, featuring a cartoon dinosaur that had been his favorite since kindergarten. "Dad, I'm hungry," Tyler announced, setting down the wrench he'd been using to help tighten a loose battery cable. Ethan glanced at the clock to 12:15. Lunch had become an increasingly creative exercise in making something from nothing. Yesterday, it had been crackers with the last of the peanut butter. Today, he wasn't sure what they'd find in the mini-fridge upstairs. "Tell you what," Ethan said, wiping his hands on a rag that was more grease than cloth. "Why don't you run upstairs and see what we've got? Maybe we can make one of our famous whatever's in the cabinet sandwiches." Tyler grinned, that same lopsided smile that Sarah used to have when she was trying to make the best of a bad situation. "With extra creativity sauce." "With extra creativity sauce," Ethan confirmed, using the phrase Sarah had coined for making their meager supplies stretch into something resembling a meal dot as Tyler bounded up the narrow stairs that led to their apartment. Ethan allowed himself a moment of quiet desperation. The garage was his life's work, but more than that, it was Tyler's stability. This building held every memory of Sarah, every dream they'd shared, every promise Ethan had made to provide for their family. Losing it wouldn't just mean financial. Ruin it would mean admitting that he'd failed at the one thing that mattered most. He walked over to the workbench where his tools lay spread out like old friends. Most of them had belonged to his father, inherited when the old man passed 5 years ago. They weren't pretty. Rust had claimed most of the chrome, and the handles were wrapped in electrical tape to keep them from falling apart. But they worked. In Ethan's hands, they could work miracles. The centerpiece of his collection was a socket wrench set that had to be 40 years old. The case held together with more tape than original material. Sarah used to joke that those tools had more miles on them than most cars, but she'd also seen what Ethan could do with them. He'd once rebuilt an entire transmission using nothing but those ancient tools and sheer stubbornness, saving a single mother $3,000 and earning the loyalty of half the town in the process. Now, staring at the eviction notice burning a hole in his pocket, Ethan wondered if stubbornness would be enough this time. 3 days to come up with 2 months' rent plus late fees money he simply didn't have and couldn't imagine finding. He'd already sold everything of value except Sarah's wedding ring, which hung on a chain around his neck, and the tools that were his livelihood. The sound of Tyler's footsteps on the stairs interrupted his spiraling thoughts. "Good news and bad news, Dad," Tyler announced, holding up a can of soup in one hand and a package of stale crackers in the other. "Good news is we've got lunch. Bad news is this might be the last can." Ethan forced a smile. "Then we'd better make it count. What do you say we eat like kings today?" They shared the soup heated on the hot plate in the garage office, sitting on overturned crates and pretending the crackers were fancy bread from a restaurant they'd never been able to afford. Tyler chattered about a book he was reading, something about a boy who could fix anything with magic tools, and Ethan listened with the part of his attention that wasn't calculating how many hours he'd need to work at what rates to save their home. After lunch, Tyler returned to his bolt sorting project with the focused intensity that reminded Ethan so much of Sarah. She'd had that same ability to find purpose in the smallest tasks, to make something ordinary feel important through sheer force of care and attention. The afternoon brought a steady trickle of customers, nothing major, mostly oil changes and minor repairs that barely covered the cost of parts. Each transaction was a small reminder of how much the community relied on his garage, even if they couldn't always pay what the work was really worth. These were his neighbors, people who'd known him and Sarah for years, people who trusted him. To be fair, even when being fair meant he barely broke even. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, that would have made Sarah reach for her camera. Ethan found himself standing in the doorway of the garage, watching Tyler play with a remote control car they'd fixed together last Christmas. The toy had been headed for the junkyard when its owner brought it in as a joke, but Tyler had seen potential where others saw trash. In 3 days, this would all be gone. The garage, the apartment, the routines that gave their lives structure and meaning. They'd have to start over somewhere else, in a place that didn't echo with Sarah's laughter or hold the weight of their shared dreams. Ethan closed his eyes and made a promise to himself, the same promise he'd made at Sarah's graveside. Whatever happened, he wouldn't let Tyler see him break. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities, new chances to prove that love and determination could overcome any obstacle. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. He had no way of knowing that tomorrow would also bring a sleek black sedan and a woman whose secrets would change everything he thought he knew about the impossible. Dawn came early to Copper Creek, painting the desert landscape in soft pastels that would be scorched away by the brutal sun within hours. Ethan White had been awake since 5, unable to sleep with the weight of the eviction notice pressing down on his chest like a stone. He'd spent the dark hours walking the perimeter of his garage, running his hands along the walls that had sheltered his family's dreams for nearly a decade. As Tyler emerged from their small apartment above the shop, rubbing sleep from his eyes and carrying his favorite stuffed elephant, a threadbare creature named Peanut that had been his companion since before Sarah's death, Ethan was already elbow deep in the engine of a 1998 Corolla that belonged to the town librarian. "Morning, Dad," Tyler mumbled, settling onto his usual milk crate with Peanut tucked securely under one arm. Even at 9, he understood the sacred quiet of early morning in the garage, when the air still held a hint of coolness and the work felt almost meditative. "Morning, buddy. Sleep okay?" Ethan's voice was muffled by the hoot of the car, but Tyler could hear the forced cheerfulness that had become more common since the money trouble started. "Dreamed about Mom again," Tyler said matter-of-factly, opening a box of cereal that was more air than actual cereal at this point. "She was teaching me how to use the big wrench, the one with the red handle." Ethan paused in his work, his throat constricting. Sarah had always said she'd teach Tyler everything about cars when he got older. She'd wanted him to understand that fixing things wasn't just about mechanical knowledge, it was about patience, intuition, and respect for the machines that carried people through their lives. "What did she say in the dream?" Ethan asked, resuming his work on the Corolla's alternator. The part was salvaged from a junkyard, cleaned and rebuilt by his own hands, because new parts were a luxury they couldn't afford. She said the red-handled wrench is special because Grandpa gave it to you, and you're supposed to give it to me someday. But first, I have to learn to listen to what the cars are trying to tell us. Tyler crunched thoughtfully on his cereal. "She said cars have feelings, just like people." Ethan smiled despite the ache in his chest. That was pure Sarah, always finding the humanity in everything, always believing that the world was more magical than it appeared on the surface. She'd been the one to suggest they name their tools, to thank each car for trusting them with its problems, to celebrate every successful repair like a small victory for the forces of good. The first customer of the day arrived, just after 7 old. Pete Martinez with his ancient pickup truck that leaked oil like a confession and made sounds that defied mechanical explanation. Pete had been coming to the garage since before Tyler was born, drawn by Ethan's reasonable prices and Sarah's legendary coffee. These days, the coffee was whatever brand was on sale at the grocery store, but Pete never complained. "Morning, Ethan." "Young Tyler," Pete nodded gravely to both of them, treating Tyler with the same respect he'd show any adult. It was something the regular customers had learned from Sarah. Tyler wasn't just a boy hanging around the garage. He was part of the team, and his observations about cars were often surprisingly insightful. "What's she doing to you today, Pete?" Ethan asked, wiping his hands on a rag and approaching the truck with the careful attention of a doctor examining a patient. "Making a noise like a dying cat when I try to back up. Started yesterday, right after I helped my daughter move into her new apartment." Pete's weathered face creased with worry. "Can't afford for her to give up on me now. Still got 3 grandkids to haul around." Tyler perked up from his spot in the corner. "Is it a grinding noise or more like a squealing?" Pete considered this. "Seriously, more like squealing, I'd say. High-pitched, like she's complaining about something." Ethan knelt beside the truck and listened as Pete demonstrated the problem. The sound was indeed like a protest, sharp and metallic, coming from the rear differential. Probably the bearings were worn, a common problem in trucks that had lived as hard as Pete's. "Good ears, Tyler," Ethan said, earning a proud grin from his son. "Sounds like your differential bearings are having a conversation with your brake pads. Nothing too serious, but we should get her looked at before it becomes something expensive." The diagnosis and repair took most of the morning, with Tyler helping by holding flashlights and organizing tools while Ethan worked in the cramped space beneath the truck. They moved together with practiced efficiency, communicating in the shorthand of people who'd spent countless hours working side by side. When Pete's truck was purring contentedly again, the old man pressed $40 into Ethan's palm, less than half what any other shop would have charged, but fair compensation for honest work honestly done. "You're too good to this old truck," Pete said, patting the hood affectionately. "And too good to this old man. We take care of each other in this town," Ethan replied, echoing something Sarah used to say. "That's how it's supposed to work." After Pete left, Tyler helped his father clean up the tools and organize the workspace for the next customer. It was a ritual they'd developed over the months since Sarah's death, way of maintaining order in a world that often felt chaotic and uncertain. "Dad?" Tyler's voice was quiet, the way it got when he was working up to asking something important. "Yeah, buddy? Are we going to be okay?" The question hit Ethan like a punch to the gut. He set down the wrench he'd been cleaning and looked at his son, really looked at him. Tyler had Sarah's green eyes and stubborn chin, but he also had the careful, watchful expression of someone who'd learned too young that the world wasn't always safe or predictable. "We're going to be fine," Ethan said, and he meant it, even though he wasn't sure how. "We've got each other, we've got our skills, and we've got more people in this town who care about us than you might think, even if we have to move." So Tyler knew. Of course he knew the boy was too smart and too observant to miss the signs. The hushed phone calls, the worried looks, the way Ethan had been working longer hours for less money. "Even if we have to move," Ethan confirmed. "Home isn't just a place, Tyler. It's the people who matter to you and the things you do together. As long as we're a team, we'll be okay." Tyler nodded solemnly, accepting this truth the way 9-year-olds accept most truths completely and without reservation. "Can we still fix cars wherever we go?" "Absolutely. These hands," Ethan held up his grease-stained palms, "they'll work anywhere. And these tools," he gestured toward the collection of ancient wrenches and sockets, "they've got plenty of good years left in them." The afternoon brought a steady stream of customers, each with their own automotive problems and their own stories. There was Mrs. Rodriguez with her minivan that wouldn't start, worried about missing her night shift at the hospital. There was Danny Thompson, home from college for the summer, whose Jeep had developed a concerning rattle. There was even a family of tourists whose SUV had overheated on the highway, grateful to find an honest mechanic who could get them back on the road without emptying their vacation fund. Each repair was a small drama, a problem to be solved with patience and skill. Tyler watched it all from his corner perch, absorbing lessons about more than just automotive repair. He was learning about service, about treating people with dignity, about finding solutions when resources were limited. As the sun began to set, Father and son shared a dinner of grilled cheese sandwiches made from day-old bread and processed cheese, sitting on their front steps and watching the last light fade from the mountains that ringed their valley. The evening air carried the scent of sage and motor oil, a combination that had become as familiar as home. "Tyler," Ethan said, setting down his sandwich and pulling the eviction notice from his pocket. "I want to show you something." He unfolded the paper carefully, smoothing out the wrinkles from where he'd crumpled it in frustration. Tyler read it slowly, his young face serious with concentration. "What does this mean?" Tyler asked, though Ethan suspected he already knew. "It means we have to find a way to pay the rent we owe, or we'll have to leave the garage." Ethan's voice was steady, matter-of-fact. "I wanted you to hear it from me, not find out some other way." Tyler was quiet for a long moment, processing this information. Then he looked up at his father with eyes that seemed older than his years. "How much do we need?" "More than we have right now," Ethan admitted. "But I'm working on it. I've got some ideas, some people I can call. We're not giving up without a fight." That night, after Tyler had gone to bed with Peanut tucked under his arm and a story about brave mechanics who could fix anything, Ethan sat alone in the garage with Sarah's tools spread out before him. The red-handled wrench Tyler had dreamed about lay in the center, its surface worn smooth by decades of faithful service. He picked up the wrench and held it up to the light, remembering the day his father had given it to him, remembering the promise he'd made to pass it on to his own son someday. These tools had fed his family, built his reputation, and connected him to a tradition of honest work that stretched back generations. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new customers, new opportunities to prove that skill and integrity were worth something in a world that often seemed to value neither. Ethan made a silent promise to the memory of his wife and the future of his son. No matter what happened, he would keep fixing things, keep helping people, keep believing that broken things could be made whole again. He had no way of knowing that tomorrow would test that belief in ways he couldn't imagine, or that the woman who would soon change his life was at that very moment driving through the night toward Copper Creek, her luxury sedan carrying secrets that would transform everything he thought he knew about second chances and the power of unexpected angels. The morning of the third day dawned with the kind of heat that seemed to press down from the sky like a weight, turning the air shimmery and making even the hardiest desert plants look wilted by 9 a.m. Ethan White had been up since before sunrise, checking and rechecking his tools, organizing his workspace, and trying to project the kind of calm confidence that might attract the miracle he desperately needed. Tyler sat in his usual corner, but today he'd abandoned his bolt-sorting project in favor of a sketch pad that had belonged to his mother. Sarah had loved to draw, filling notebook after notebook with detailed illustrations of flowers, buildings, and especially the cars that came through their garage. Tyler had inherited her artistic eye, and his current drawing showed their garage as he imagined it might look if they had unlimited resources, fresh paint, new equipment, and a sign that didn't lean quite so dramatically to the left. "Think we'll get some good customers today?" Tyler asked, not looking up from his sketch but clearly seeking reassurance. "I think we'll get exactly the customers we're supposed to get," Ethan replied, echoing something Sarah used to say. She'd believed that everything happened for a reason, that the right people showed up at the right times if you were paying attention and staying open to possibilities. The first customer of the day was Jimmy Chun, a regular whose battered Honda had been limping along on prayers and creative problem-solving for the better part of 2 years. Jimmy worked double shifts at the meatpacking plant outside town and couldn't afford a newer car, but he could afford Ethan's reasonable rates and trusted the quality of work that came from White's auto repair. "She's making that grinding noise again," Jimmy said apologetically, as if the car's problems were somehow his fault. "I know you just fixed the brakes last month, but ... No worries, Jimmy. Let's take a listen." Ethan approached the Honda with the careful attention of a doctor. examining a longtime patient. He'd worked on this car so many times that he knew its quirks and personality better than some people knew their own families. The diagnosis was straightforward worn brake pads that had been stretching their useful life well beyond reasonable limits. It was a $30 part and an hour of labor, but for Jimmy, $30 might as well have been $300. "How bad is it?" Jimmy asked, and Ethan could hear the anxiety in his voice. Like so many of Ethan's customers, Jimmy was living paycheck to paycheck, one unexpected expense away from serious trouble. "Bad enough that you shouldn't drive it much until we get it fixed," Ethan said honestly. "But not so bad that we can't work something out. How about you pay for the parts today and catch me up on the labor when you get your next check?" The relief on Jimmy's face was worth more than the $40 Ethan was essentially lending him. This was how business worked in Copper Creek: on trust, on understanding that people were doing their best with what they had, on the belief that kindness would eventually circle back around. While Ethan worked on Jimmy's Honda, Tyler kept up a steady stream of quiet observations and questions that showed he was absorbing everything about the process. Where did the grinding noise come from? Why were these brake pads wearing faster than the ones on Pete's truck? How could you tell if someone was taking good care of their car just by looking at the way they drove? "You're getting good at this," Ethan told his son as they waited for the brake pads to settle properly. "Mom would be proud of how much you've learned." Tyler beamed at the praise, then returned to his sketchpad with renewed focus. His latest drawing showed a detailed cutaway view of a brake system, complete with labels and arrows. The technical accuracy was impressive for a 9-year-old. But what struck Ethan most was the care Tyler had taken with each line, the way he'd made even the mundane mechanics of stopping a car look elegant and important. Just after noon, when the heat had reached the point where even moving felt like an effort, Ethan heard the distinctive sound of an expensive engine pulling into his lot. He looked up from the alternator he'd been rebuilding to see a sleek black sedan, something European and obviously costly, roll into a stop near the garage entrance. Steam was rising from under the hood in lazy wisps, and the car's normally pristine paint job was dulled by a layer of desert dust that suggested it had been driving for hours through less than ideal conditions. The engine ticked and pinged with the sound of overheated metal cooling down, a symphony of automotive distress that Ethan recognized immediately. The driver's door opened, and out stepped a woman who looked like she'd been transported from a different world entirely. She was probably in her early 30s, with dark hair pulled back in a sleek ponytail and clothes that managed to look both practical and expensive, dark jeans that fit perfectly, a white button-down shirt that somehow remained crisp despite the heat, and boots that were clearly designed for looking good rather than working in. But it was her face that caught Ethan's attention. Despite the obvious frustration of dealing with a broken-down car in the middle of nowhere, despite the heat that was making even the hardiest locals wilt, she carried herself with a quiet confidence that suggested she was used to solving problems and making things happen. "Excuse me," she called out, approaching the garage with the careful gait of someone wearing inappropriate shoes for gravel. "I'm hoping you might be able to help me. My car seems to have developed some issues." Her voice carried just a hint of an accent, something East Coast and educated, the kind of accent that usually belonged to people who flew over places like Copper Creek rather than stopping in them. "Happy to take a look," Ethan replied, wiping his hands on a rag that was more grease than cloth. "What kind of trouble is she giving you?" "Overheating, I think. The temperature gauge has been climbing for the last 50 miles, and now there's steam coming from under the hood." She gestured toward the sedan with the resigned expression of someone who was accustomed to having other people fix her problems, but found herself without that luxury. Ethan approached the car with Tyler trailing behind him, both of them drawn by professional curiosity and the rarity of seeing such an expensive vehicle in their humble garage. The sedan was a late model BMW, probably worth more than Ethan Made in 2 years, but money couldn't protect it from the basic realities of overheated coolant and failing hoses. "Let's see what we're dealing with," Ethan said, popping the hood and immediately stepping back as a cloud of steam escaped. The engine bay was pristine, except for the obvious signs of cooling system. Failure. A burst radiator hose had been spraying coolant across the engine block, and the reservoir was bone dry. "Looks like your radiator hose gave up the fight," Ethan explained, pointing to the split rubber tube that hung limply from its mounting points. "Probably been developing a small leak for a while, but the desert heat finished it off. The good news is, it's a relatively simple fix. The challenging news is that I don't have the exact replacement part for a car like this." The woman, who still hadn't introduced herself, looked at the failed hose with the expression of someone trying to understand a foreign language. "What does that mean, exactly?" "It means I can fix it, but I'll have to get creative. I can fashion a temporary repair using parts I have on hand, or I can call around and try to find the right hose, which might take a day or two." Ethan studied her face, trying to gauge whether she was the type of person who could handle uncertainty, or needed everything resolved immediately. "How temporary is temporary?" she asked, and he could hear the calculation in her voice. Someone used to weighing options and making quick decisions based on incomplete information. "Should get you wherever you're going, as long as you keep an eye on the temperature gauge. And don't push too hard. Where are you headed?" For the first time since she'd arrived, the woman hesitated. "I'm not entirely sure yet. I was supposed to be in Phoenix this morning, but I took a detour and ended up here instead." It was an odd answer, the kind of response that suggested there was more to the story than she was sharing. But Ethan had learned long ago not to pry into his customers' personal business. People ended up in Copper Creek for all kinds of reasons, and most of them weren't particularly interested in sharing the details with strangers. "Well, either way, you're not going anywhere until this gets fixed," he said. "Why don't you park her in the shade over there, and I'll get started on a solution." As the woman moved her car into the shaded area beside the garage, Tyler tugged on his father's sleeve. "Dad," he whispered, "look at her hands." Ethan glanced over at their unexpected customer and saw what Tyler had noticed. Despite her expensive clothes and obvious wealth, the woman's hands told a different story. They were neat and well cared for, but there were small calluses on her palms and a thin scar across one knuckle, signs of someone who had worked with tools at some point in her life. "Interesting," Ethan murmured, filing away this observation for future reference. The woman returned from parking her car, moving with the careful precision of someone navigating unfamiliar terrain. "How long do you think the repair will take?" she asked. "Give me about an hour to jury-rig something that'll hold," Ethan replied. "But you might want to find somewhere air-conditioned to wait. It's only going to get hotter out here. Is there a restaurant or cafe nearby where I could get lunch while I wait?" Ethan almost laughed but caught himself. Copper Creek's idea of dining options was considerably more limited than what someone driving a BMW might be accustomed to. "There's Marlene's Diner about 2 blocks down Main Street," he said. "Good food, reasonable prices, and she keeps the air conditioning cranked high enough to store meat. Tell her Ethan sent you, and she'll take good care of you." The woman nodded, then paused as if considering something. "I don't think I introduced myself. I'm Savannah. Ethan White. This is my son Tyler, and this is White's Auto Repair. We'll get you back on the road." "Thank you, Ethan. I appreciate you helping out a stranded stranger." As Savannah walked away toward town, her expensive boots clicking against the cracked asphalt of the parking lot, Tyler looked up at his father with the expression of someone who had just witnessed something significant. "She's different," Tyler said simply. "Different how? I don't know yet. But she's not what she looks like." Ethan watched Savannah disappear around the corner, noting the confident way she carried herself despite being obviously out of her element. Tyler was right there. Was something about their unexpected customer that didn't quite add up. But then again, everyone had their secrets, and Ethan White had enough problems of his own without trying to solve mysteries that weren't his business. What he didn't know was that Savannah Moore, as she'd identified herself to the hostess at Marlene's Diner, was at that moment sitting in a cracked vinyl booth, staring at her phone and trying to decide whether to answer the 17 missed calls from her assistant back in Seattle. She was the CEO of Horizon Renewable Energy, one of the fastest-growing clean technology companies in the country, and she was supposed to be in Phoenix closing a deal that would transform solar energy infrastructure across the Southwest. Instead, she was in a town that barely existed on most maps, drinking surprisingly good coffee and thinking about the way Ethan White had approached her broken car with the same careful attention she'd once seen her grandfather give to the vintage Mustang he'd restored in his garage behind the house, where she'd spent her summers as a little girl. But Ethan didn't know any of that yet. All he knew was that he had a job to do, a radiator hose to replace, and a miracle to accomplish with nothing but rusty tools and the kind of stubborn determination that had been keeping him and Tyler afloat for the past 2 years. He had no idea that the woman currently sitting in Marlene's Diner was about to become the answer to prayers he hadn't even dared to pray. Ethan stood in the sweltering heat of his garage, studying the burst radiator hose in his hands like a surgeon examining a particularly challenging case. The BMW's engine bay was immaculate despite the cooling system failure. Someone had been taking excellent care of this car, which made the sudden hose failure all the more puzzling. Quality vehicles like this didn't usually develop problems overnight unless they'd been pushed beyond their normal limits. Tyler appeared at his elbow, carrying a mason jar filled with ice water that had already begun to sweat in the oppressive heat. "Thought you might be thirsty," he said, offering the jar with the serious expression he wore whenever he was trying to be helpful. "Thanks, buddy. Perfect timing." Ethan took a long drink, grateful for both the cold water and Tyler's thoughtfulness. The boy had inherited Sarah's ability to anticipate needs, to offer comfort in small but meaningful ways. "Dad, why do you think she was driving through Copper Creek?" Tyler asked, settling onto his milk crate and pulling out his sketch pad. "I mean, we're not really on the way to anywhere important." It was a good question. The main highway bypassed their town entirely, and the back roads that led through Copper Creek were the kind of routes people only took if they were either lost or deliberately avoiding the faster options. Savannah had mentioned being supposed to be in Phoenix that morning, but Phoenix was 3 hours away, and this route would have added at least an hour to the trip, even if her car hadn't broken down. Maybe she just wanted to see some country that wasn't all interstate and chain restaurants, Ethan suggested, though he wasn't entirely convinced by his own explanation. Some people like taking the scenic route. Tyler nodded thoughtfully then, began sketching what looked like a detailed diagram of the BMW's cooling system. Even at 9, he had an intuitive understanding of how mechanical systems fit together, and his drawings often revealed insights that surprised the adults around him. Ethan turned his attention back to the broken hose, measuring its length and diameter against the assortment of replacement parts he kept in stock. Nothing was an exact match, but he'd spent years learning how to make mismatched parts work together. It was a skill born of necessity when you couldn't afford the perfect solution. You learned to create good enough solutions that would last. Until something better came along. The work required careful attention to detail and a kind of mechanical empathy that couldn't be taught from books. Ethan had to understand not just what the original part was supposed to do, but how his improvised replacement would interact with the rest of the system under different conditions. Too tight, and the hose might split under pressure. Too loose, and it would leak coolant all over the desert highways. He was in the middle of testing the fit when he heard footsteps approaching across the gravel lot. Savannah had returned from lunch, moving with the slightly easier gait of someone who had spent an hour in air conditioning and was feeling marginally more human as a result. "How's the patient?" she asked, approaching the car with what looked like genuine interest rather than the impatient urgency he might have expected from someone driving such an expensive vehicle. "She's going to be fine," Ethan replied, holding up the modified hose assembly he'd been working on. "Had to get a little creative with the replacement parts, but this should get you where you're going. Might want to have your regular mechanic take a proper look when you get home, though." Savannah examined the jury-rigged repair with more attention than most customers bothered to give such things. She ran her fingers along the connection points and studied the way Ethan had reinforced the joints with additional clamps. "That's clever," she said, and there was something in her voice that suggested she understood what she was looking at. "Using the reducing coupler to bridge the size difference. I wouldn't have thought of that." Ethan paused in his work, surprised. Most people, even those who were generally mechanically inclined, wouldn't have recognized the specific technique he'd used, much less understood why it was necessary. "You know something about cars?" he asked. "A little. My grandfather was a mechanic, had his own shop back in Ohio. I spent summers with him when I was Tyler's age, learning to change oil and adjust carburetors." Savannah's expression softened. "With the memory. He always said that fixing cars was like solving puzzles, except the pieces could bite you if you weren't careful." Tyler looked up from his sketchpad with sudden interest. "Did he teach you about listening to what the cars are telling you?" "He did, actually. Said every engine had its own voice, and if you paid attention, it would tell you exactly what was wrong." Savannah knelt down to Tyler's level, genuinely engaging with him rather than offering the kind of patronizing attention adults sometimes gave to youngsters. "He sounds like a smart man. What kind of cars does your dad work on?" "Everything," Tyler said proudly. "Old trucks, fancy cars, motorcycles, even a tractor once. Dad says every machine has a story, and our job is to help it tell the ending it wants to tell." Ethan felt a familiar warmth at hearing Tyler repeat one of Sarah's favorite philosophies. She'd been the one to frame their work in such poetic terms. To find meaning and dignity in the daily routine of keeping other people's vehicles running. "That's a beautiful way to think about it," Savannah said, and Ethan could tell she meant it. "Your grandfather would have liked that idea." As Ethan worked on installing the modified hose, Savannah continued talking with Tyler about cars and machines and the satisfying challenge of fixing broken things. She didn't check her phone, didn't seem impatient with the pace of the repair, didn't act like she had somewhere more important to be. Instead, she appeared genuinely interested in the process, asking intelligent questions about the techniques Ethan was using and the reasoning behind his choices. "Why did you choose that particular clamp size?" she asked as Ethan tightened the final connection. "Because the next size up would have been too big for the hose to grip properly, but the next size down wouldn't have provided enough surface area to distribute the pressure," Ethan explained. "It's all about finding the balance between security and flexibility. Makes sense, and if the connection fails, then you'll get a warning before anything catastrophic happens. The temperature gauge will start climbing, and you'll see steam. Before any real damage occurs, just pull over, let things cool down, and call for help." Savannah nodded, absorbing this information with the focused attention of someone who was filing it away for future reference. "How often do repairs like this actually fail?" "Depends on how well they're done and how hard you push the system afterward," Ethan said honestly. "This should hold up fine for normal driving, but I wouldn't recommend racing across the desert in triple-digit heat." Tyler giggled at the mental image of the elegant sedan racing across the desert, like something from an action movie. "Do you ever drive fast?" he asked Savannah. "Not as fast as I used to," she replied with a smile that suggested there were stories behind that statement. "These days I'm more interested in getting where I'm going in one piece than getting there quickly." As Ethan added coolant to the system and prepared to test the repair, Savannah walked around the garage with the careful attention of someone cataloging details for later consideration. She paused at the workbench where his tools were laid out, running her fingers lightly over the handles of wrenches that had been serving faithfully for decades. "These are beautiful," she said, picking up the red-handled wrench that had figured so prominently in Tyler's recent dreams. "How old are they?" "Most of them belong to my father," Ethan said, wiping coolant from his hands. "That one's probably 40 years old, maybe more. Still works as well as the day it was made. Better than some of the modern tools, I bet. There's something to be said for things that were built to last." Savannah set the wrench down carefully, treating it with the respect due to a well-loved tool. "Your father must have been a good mechanic." "He was. Taught me everything I know about fixing things and treating people fairly." Ethan gestured toward a faded photograph on the wall that showed a younger version of himself standing next to an older man beside a beautifully restored Chevelle. "He used to say that the car would tell you what was wrong if you knew how to listen." "Sounds like wisdom runs in the family," Savannah said, glancing meaningfully at Tyler, who was now sketching what appeared to be a detailed portrait of the red-handled wrench. The test of the cooling system went perfectly. The engine reached normal operating temperature and stayed there. The modified hose held without leaking, and the BMW purred with the satisfaction of a machine that had been properly cared for. "All set," Ethan announced, closing the hood and wiping his hands on his ever-present rag. "She should get you wherever you're going without any trouble." Savannah pulled out her wallet, a slim leather thing that probably cost more than some of Ethan's tools, and extracted several bills. "What do I owe you?" Ethan had been dreading this moment all afternoon. The repair had taken nearly 2 hours, used specialized parts, and required the kind of creative problem-solving that most shops would charge premium rates for. Under normal circumstances, he would have asked for at least $150. But these weren't normal circumstances. He needed every dollar he could get. But he also couldn't bring himself to take advantage of someone who was stranded and had no choice but to accept whatever price he quoted. $50 should cover it, he said, the words feeling inadequate even as he spoke them. Savannah stared at him for a long moment, and he could see her doing the same kind of mental calculation he'd just completed. She knew as well as he did that the repair was worth more than he was asking. "That seems low for the amount of work you put in," she said carefully. "It's fair compensation for the parts and time," Ethan replied, sticking to his decision even though the voice in his head was screaming about missed opportunities and bills that needed paying. Instead of arguing, Savannah handed him $100 bill. "Then this is fair compensation for the quality of work and the fact that you saved my day." "I can't make change for this," Ethan said, holding up the bill. "I'm not asking you to." They stood there for a moment, the extra $50 hanging between them like a bridge that neither was quite sure how to cross. Finally, Tyler broke the silence. "Dad always charges fair prices," he said matter-of-factly. "Mom used to say, that's why people trust us." Savannah looked at Tyler, then at Ethan, and something shifted in her expression, a recognition of the principles that governed this place and the people who ran it. "Your mom sounds like she was a wise woman," Savannah said softly. "She was," Ethan replied. "She's the one who taught us that taking care of people's cars means taking care of people." As Savannah prepared to leave, she paused at the driver's door of her BMW and looked back at the garage, really looked at it, as if she were seeing it for the first time. Her gaze took in the faded paint, the collection of mismatched tools, the careful organization that spoke of people making do with what they had, and the obvious love that had gone into maintaining this small corner of automotive sanctuary. "Thank you," she said, and the words carried more weight than a simple acknowledgement of services rendered. "Both of you. This has been exactly what I needed today." She drove away slowly, her BMW purring contentedly as it carried her back toward the main road and whatever destination she'd been avoiding earlier. Ethan and Tyler stood in the entrance of their garage, watching until the sedan disappeared around the bend that led toward the highway. "I like her," Tyler announced, settling back onto his milk crate and returning to his sketch pad. "Yeah," Ethan agreed, fingering the $100 bill in his pocket and thinking about the way Savannah had looked at his tools with genuine appreciation. "I like her too." Neither of them mentioned the fact that they would probably never see her again, or that $50 extra, while helpful, wouldn't be nearly enough to solve their larger problems. But for the moment, it was enough to know that they had done good work for a good person. And that somewhere out there, a broken fin had been made whole again. What they couldn't know was that Savannah Moore was at that moment sitting in her car in the parking lot of Marlene's diner, staring at her phone and thinking about the contrast between the million-dollar deals she negotiated in boardrooms and the simple dignity of a man who could have charged her twice what he asked and chose not to. She was thinking about calloused hands that could work miracles with rusty tools, about a 9-year-old boy who saw beauty in mechanical drawings, and about the faded photograph of a family that had built something meaningful in the middle of nowhere. Most of all, she was thinking about the promise she'd made to her grandfather the day he died, that someday, when she had the power to make a difference, she would find a way to honor the values he'd taught her in that little garage behind his house. Ethan White had no way of knowing that he had just passed a test he didn't realize he was taking, or that his simple act of honest work and fair dealing was about to change his life in ways he couldn't imagine. All he knew was that for the first time in months, he felt like maybe, just maybe, tomorrow might bring something worth hoping for. 3 days had passed since the black BMW had disappeared. Around the bend, taking Savannah back toward whatever life awaited her beyond Copper Creek's dusty borders, Ethan had almost convinced himself that the encounter had been nothing more than a pleasant interlude, a reminder that there were still people in the world who appreciated honest work and fair dealing, even if they were just passing through. Then, on Thursday morning, as he was replacing the worn brake pads on Mrs. Patterson's ancient Buick, he heard the familiar sound of that same expensive engine pulling into his lot. Tyler looked up from the corner, where he'd been organizing spare parts, his face brightening with the kind of smile that had been rare since Sarah's death. "She came back." Ethan emerged from beneath the Buick, wiping his hands on his perpetually grease-stained rag, trying to hide his own surprise at seeing Savannah again. This time, she wasn't dressed in the crisp business attire of their first meeting. Instead, she wore faded jeans, a plain white t-shirt, and work boots that looked like they'd actually been worked in. "Car giving you trouble again?" he asked, approaching the BMW with professional concern. "No, actually the repair is holding up perfectly," Savannah replied, popping the hood anyway. "I wanted to show you something, and I thought you might want to check your handiwork while I'm here." Ethan peered into the engine bay and was pleased to see that his improvised hose repair was functioning exactly as intended. No leaks, no signs of stress, no indication that the cooling system was anything other than completely healthy. "Looks good," he said, closing the hood with satisfaction. "What did you want to show me?" Instead of answering immediately, Savannah walked to the passenger side of her car and retrieved a brown paper bag that had been sitting on the seat. "I brought lunch," she announced, "and some things I thought Tyler might like." The bag contained an assortment of sandwiches from what was obviously a much more upscale establishment than Marlene's diner, along with fresh fruit, homemade cookies, and several automotive magazines that looked like they'd been purchased specifically for a 9-year-old with a mechanical bent. "This is too much," Ethan protested, though Tyler was already reaching for one of the magazines with obvious enthusiasm. "It's exactly enough," Savannah replied firmly. "Besides, I have ulterior motives. I was hoping you might have time to look at something else for me." She led them to the trunk of the BMW, which she opened to reveal a piece of automotive history that made both Ethan and Tyler gasp audibly. Nestled in protective blankets was what appeared to be a complete carburetor assembly, but not just any carburetor. This was a pristine Holley 4-barrel, the kind of precision instrument that had powered muscle cars through their golden age. Found this in my grandfather's garage when I was cleaning out his house last month, Savannah explained, lifting the carburetor carefully from its resting place. I know it's probably worth something, but I'm not sure if it's worth restoring, or if I should just sell it to a collector. Ethan accepted the carburetor with the reverence due to a piece of mechanical art. Even covered in decades of dust and grime, he could see the quality of the construction, the careful engineering that had made these units so prized among serious automotive enthusiasts. This is a real beauty, he said, turning the carburetor over in his hands. Probably came off something special, maybe a Camaro or a Chevelle. Your grandfather had good taste. He always said that carburetor was the heart of any real car. Savannah replied, watching as Tyler climbed up to get a better look at the vintage part. Said fuel injection was more efficient, but carburetors had soul. Tyler reached out carefully, running his small fingers along the carburetor's throttle linkage with a gentle touch Sarah had taught him to use with delicate mechanical components. It's like a puzzle, he said wonderingly. All these little parts working together to make the engine breathe. Savannah smiled at Tyler's description. That's exactly what my grandfather used to say. He told me that rebuilding a carburetor was like teaching an engine how to sing again. They spent the next hour examining the carburetor together, with Ethan explaining the function of each component, while Tyler asked the kind of insightful questions that demonstrated his growing understanding of automotive systems. Savannah listened, with the attention of someone who was genuinely interested in learning, occasionally asking questions that revealed her own foundational knowledge. The question is, Ethan said finally, what do you want to do with it? A collector might pay good money for this in its current condition, but if you're thinking about restoration, it would need a complete rebuild. How complete? Savannah asked. Everything. New gaskets, new jets, probably new accelerator pumps, complete cleaning and calibration. It's not cheap, and there's no guarantee it would be worth more afterward than what a collector would pay for it now. Savannah was quiet for a moment, turning the carburetor over in her hands much the way Ethan had done earlier. What would your grandfather have done? She asked Tyler. Tyler considered this seriously, his young face scrunched in concentration. He would have asked what the carburetor wanted to be, he said finally. Mom always said that broken things tell you whether they want to be fixed or whether they're ready to rest. And what do you think this one wants? Tyler studied the carburetor again, paying particular attention to the way the sunlight caught the polished surfaces beneath the grime. I think it wants to breathe again, he said softly. Savannah nodded as if Tyler had provided exactly the answer she'd been hoping for. Then let's see about making that happen. How much would a complete restoration cost? Ethan found himself in the familiar position of trying to quote a fair price for work that would require both skill and time. A proper carburetor rebuild could take anywhere from a day to a week, depending on what problems they discovered once they started taking things apart. Parts and labor, probably around $400, he said honestly. Maybe less if we don't run into any major problems, maybe more if we find something unusual. That seems reasonable for bringing a piece of history back to life, Savannah replied. When could you start? I could start right now if you want. Mrs. Patterson's Buick will be ready in about an hour, and then I'm free until tomorrow morning. They moved it to workbench, where Ethan began the careful process of disassembly, while Tyler documented each step with detailed sketches, and Savannah asked questions that demonstrated she was following the process with genuine interest. Why do you start with the fuel bowls? She asked as Ethan carefully removed the first set of screws. Because that's where most of the problems usually hide, Ethan explained. 40 years of sitting means 40 years of fuel residue, oxidation, and corrosion. If we're lucky, it's just cosmetic. If we're not, we get to exercise our creative problem-solving skills. Tyler finished, repeating something he'd heard his father say countless times. As they worked, their conversation naturally drifted from mechanical details to more personal topics. Savannah talked about her grandfather, a man who had apparently instilled in her both a love of well-made things and a respect for the people who made them. She described summers spent learning to use tools properly, to take apart engines without losing track of where each piece belonged, to understand that good work required both patience and precision. "He sounds like he was a special man," Ethan said, cleaning years of grime from a particularly intricate jet assembly. "He was. He's the one who taught me that how you treat your tools says something about how you treat everything else in your life." Savannah gestured toward Ethan's carefully organized workbench. "He would have approved of this setup." Tyler looked up from his sketchpad. "Did he teach you about listening to engines?" "He did. Said every engine had its own personality, and if you paid attention, you could tell what it needed just by the way it sounded." Savannah paused in her examination of a carburetor gasket. "He also said that the best mechanics weren't the ones with the fanciest tools. They were the ones who could make any tool do exactly what they needed it to do." It was a philosophy that resonated deeply with Ethan's own approach to mechanical work. In his hands, the ancient wrenches and jury-rigged equipment became extensions of his will, capable of accomplishing repairs that would challenge shops with 10 times his resources. As the afternoon wore on, they settled into a comfortable rhythm of work and conversation. Tyler continued his detailed documentation of the restoration process, creating what was essentially a technical manual illustrated with the careful precision of someone who understood that small details mattered. Savannah proved to be surprisingly helpful, her hands showing the muscle memory of someone who had indeed spent time learning to work with tools. "You're pretty good at this," Ethan observed as Savannah successfully extracted a stubborn jet without damaging the surrounding components. "Muscle memory," she replied. "Some things you never really forget, even if you don't use them for years." By late afternoon, they had completely disassembled the carburetor, cataloged every component, and identified the parts that would need replacement. The damage was less extensive than Ethan had feared, mostly cosmetic issues and a few worn gaskets that were easily replaceable. "The good news is that your grandfather took excellent care of this," Ethan announced, laying out the cleaned components on a pristine shop towel. "Everything is in remarkably good condition for its age. The bad news is that we'll have to wait for a couple of specialized gaskets to arrive before we can put it back together." "How long?" Savannah asked. "Probably a week, maybe 2. These aren't exactly common parts anymore." Savannah nodded, then surprised Ethan by asking, "Would it be all right if I came by occasionally to check on the progress? I know it's probably unusual, but I'm curious about the process." "Of course," Ethan replied, though privately he wondered why someone driving a BMW would be interested in spending time in his modest garage watching carburetor repairs. "You're welcome anytime." As Savannah prepared to leave, Tyler presented her with one of his detailed sketches, cutaway view of the carburetor that showed each component in its proper relationship to the whole. "This is for your grandfather," Tyler said solemnly. "So he knows we're taking good care of his carburetor." Savannah accepted the drawing with the same reverence she might have shown a priceless work of art. "Thank you, Tyler. This is beautiful. I think he would have been very impressed with your attention to detail." After Savannah left, Ethan and Tyler cleaned up their workspace and prepared to close the garage for the evening. The familiar routine of organizing tools and securing equipment felt different, somehow charged with the possibility that tomorrow might bring more than just the usual parade of routine repairs. "Dad," Tyler said as they walked toward the stairs that led to their apartment. "Yeah, buddy?" "I think she's going to keep coming back." "What makes you say that?" Tyler considered this carefully, his young face serious with concentration. Because she looks at things the same way Mom used to. Like she can see what they're supposed to be, not just what they are right now. That night, as Tyler worked on his latest sketch and Ethan reviewed the day's receipts, neither of them mentioned the fact that Savannah's presence had made the garage feel more alive than it had in months. But both of them were thinking about the way she had handled the carburetor components with genuine respect, the way she had listened to Tyler's explanations without condescension, and the way she had seemed genuinely interested in the process of restoration rather than just the end result. What they couldn't know was that Savannah Moore was at that moment sitting in her hotel room in the next town over, staring at Tyler's sketch and thinking about the promise she had made to herself to honor her grandfather's memory by supporting the kind of people who shared his values. She was also thinking about a 9-year-old boy who saw mechanical systems as art and a man who could work miracles with tools that most shops would have thrown away decades ago. Tomorrow she would make some phone calls that would set in motion events none of them could imagine. But tonight, for the first time in months, Ethan White fell asleep thinking about something other than eviction notices and unpaid bills. Tonight, he dreamed about carburetors that sang and tools that told stories, and the possibility that broken things really could be made whole again. The specialized gaskets arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered by a UPS truck that looked comically out of place navigating Copper Creek's dusty streets. Ethan signed for the package with the satisfaction of someone who had spent days anticipating this moment, while Tyler practically bounced with excitement at the prospect of finally completing the carburetor restoration. "Can we call Savannah?" Tyler asked, already reaching for the garage phone that hung on the wall next to Sarah's faded calendar. "She said she wanted to be here when we put it back together." "Let's give her a few minutes to get here before we start," Ethan agreed. Though privately he was surprised by how much he was looking forward to sharing this moment with someone who would truly appreciate the craftsmanship involved. Savannah arrived within an hour, carrying a thermos of coffee that smelled considerably better than anything Ethan typically managed to brew on the garage's ancient hot plate. She also brought something else, a manila folder that she set carefully on the workbench before turning her attention to the carburetor components laid out in precise order. "Ready to bring this beauty back to life?" she asked, rolling up her sleeves with the practiced motion of someone preparing for serious work. The reassembly process was like watching a complex mechanical ballet. Each gasket had to be positioned precisely, each bolt tightened to exactly the right torque, each adjustment made with the kind of patience that distinguished craftsmen from mere technicians. Tyler documented every step with his characteristic attention to detail, while Savannah proved surprisingly adept at anticipating which tool Ethan would need next. "Your grandfather really did teach you well," Ethan observed as Savannah successfully completed a particularly delicate adjustment to the float mechanism. "He was a patient teacher," Savannah replied, but there was something in her voice that suggested the memory carried both joy and sadness. "He always said that working with your hands was a form of meditation, that if you paid attention to what you were doing, really paid attention, the rest of the world would quiet down for a while." Tyler looked up from his sketch pad. "Mom used to say something like that. She said fixing cars was like prayer, except instead of asking for things, you were making things better with your own hands." The mention of Sarah brought a familiar tightness to Ethan's chest, but it was a gentler ache than usual, softened somehow by the presence of someone who understood the spiritual dimension of mechanical work. "She sounds like she was a wise woman," Savannah said softly. "How long has it been?" 2 years in October, Ethan replied, his hands continuing their work even as his voice grew thick with emotion. "Cancer. By the time they caught it, there wasn't much anyone could do except make sure she was comfortable at the end." "That must have been incredibly difficult." Ethan nodded, surprising himself by continuing to talk. "The hardest part was watching her worry about us. Even when she could barely get out of bed, she was making lists of things I'd need to remember, trying to teach Tyler cooking recipes he was too young to understand, organizing the garage files, so I could find everything after she was gone. Tyler had stopped sketching and was listening with the solemn attention he always gave to conversations about his mother. She made Dad promise to keep the garage open, he added quietly. Said this place was important for people who didn't have anywhere else to go when their cars broke down. And you've kept that promise, Savannah observed, watching as Ethan made a final adjustment to the carburetor's throttle linkage. Tried to, but it's been harder than I expected. Sarah was the one who handled the business side of things, the customer relations, the part of the work that involved actually talking to people instead of just fixing their cars. Ethan set down his wrench and looked directly at Savannah for the first time since the conversation had turned personal. I'm good with machines. People are more complicated. Yet you seem to have figured out how to take care of both Tyler and your customers pretty well. Some days better than others, Ethan admitted. There are nights when I wonder if I'm doing right by either of them. Tyler deserves stability, a father who can provide for him without constantly worrying about money. And the customers deserve a shop that can afford to stock the right parts instead of always having to jury-rig solutions. Savannah was quiet for a long moment, her attention apparently focused on cleaning a small component that was already spotless. When she finally spoke, her voice was carefully controlled. My grandfather went through something similar after my grandmother died. He'd built his whole life around their partnership, and when she was gone, he felt like he was failing at everything. That had come naturally when they were a team. She paused, meeting Ethan's eyes. But what he eventually realized was that grief makes us question everything, even the things we're actually doing right. What happened to his shop? He kept it, going for another 15 years. Not because it was easy, but because it mattered. Because there were people in his community who depended on him, and because the work itself was a way of honoring what he and my grandmother had built together. Savannah's voice grew softer. He used to say that love doesn't end when people, it just changes shape. Tyler had returned to his sketching, but Ethan could tell he was absorbing every word of the conversation. The boy had an uncanny ability to understand adult emotions, even when the adults themselves were struggling to make sense of them. What about you? Ethan asked, surprising himself with his directness. You talk about your grandfather like he was the most important person in your life, but you must have other family, other responsibilities. For the first time since he'd met her, Savannah seemed genuinely uncomfortable. She set down the component she'd been cleaning and looked out toward the desert mountains that ringed Copper Creek. I do have other responsibilities, she said finally. More than I probably should, if I'm being honest. I've spent the last 10 years building something I thought would make my grandfather proud. But somewhere along the way, I lost track of why it mattered in the first place. What kind of work do you do? Another long pause. Business consulting. Helping companies figure out how to grow without losing sight of their values. It wasn't exactly a lie, but Ethan could sense there was more to the story than she was sharing. Must be challenging work. It can be, especially when you realize that some companies have forgotten what their values were supposed to be in the first place. Savannah turned back to the workbench, her expression troubled. Sometimes I wonder if I've forgotten too. The carburetor was nearly complete now, its polished surfaces gleaming in the afternoon sunlight that streamed through the garage's open doors. As Ethan made the final adjustments, Tyler moved closer to document the finished product with the same careful attention he'd given to every stage of the restoration process. There, Ethan announced, stepping back to admire their collective handiwork. She's ready to sing again. The restored carburetor was indeed a thing of beauty, every surface clean and properly adjusted, every component working in perfect harmony with every other component. It was the kind of mechanical poetry that justified the hours of careful work and patient attention to detail. It's perfect, Savannah breathed, and there were tears in her eyes as she studied the completed restoration. My grandfather would have been so proud to see this. Tyler looked up from his final sketch. Do you think he can see it? I think, Savannah said slowly, that the people we love never really leave us as long as we keep doing the things that would have made them smile. As they cleaned up their workspace and prepared to secure the restored carburetor for safekeeping, Ethan found himself thinking about the manila folder Savannah had brought with her, the one she'd set aside and apparently forgotten in the emotional intensity of the afternoon's work, but he didn't ask about it. Some secrets, he'd learned, revealed themselves when the time was right. And today had been about restoration and memory and the strange comfort of working alongside someone who understood that broken things could indeed be made beautiful again. The manila folder sat on Ethan's workbench for 3 days, its presence a constant reminder of secrets not yet shared. Savannah had left it behind in her hurry to catch a phone call that had pulled her away from the garage just as they were admiring the completed carburetor restoration. She'd promised to return for it, but Tuesday stretched into Wednesday, then Thursday. With no sign of her familiar BMW. Tyler kept glancing at the folder with the curiosity that defined his 9-year-old mind. But Ethan had taught him that other people's belongings were to be respected, not investigated. Still, the boy's questions were becoming more frequent and increasingly direct. What do you think is in there, Dad? Tyler asked Thursday evening as they closed up the garage. Probably business papers, Ethan replied, though he'd been wondering the same thing. Nothing that concerns us, but what if it's important? What? If she needs it for work? It was a fair point. Ethan had been expecting Savannah to call about the folder, but his phone had remained stubbornly silent. He'd tried calling the number she'd given him, but it went straight to voicemail, and he wasn't entirely sure what message to leave. Friday morning brought an unexpected visitor, a man in expensive suit driving a rented sedan who seemed dramatically out of place in Copper Creek's dusty landscape. He approached the garage with the purposeful stride of someone accustomed to having his questions answered quickly and completely. "Excuse me," the man said, pulling out his phone to check something. On the screen, "I'm looking for someone named Savannah Moore. I was told she might be here." Ethan wiped his hands on his rag, immediately wary. "Haven't seen her in a few days. Is there something I can help you with?" "David Chen, executive assistant to Ms. Moore," the man said, extending a business card that felt heavy and expensive. "She's missed several important meetings this week, and her office is concerned about her whereabouts." Tyler appeared at Ethan's elbow, studying the business card with the focused attention he usually reserved for mechanical drawings. "What kind of office?" he asked. David Chen glanced down at Tyler with the slightly impatient expression of someone unaccustomed to being questioned by youngsters. "Horizon Renewable Energy. Ms. Moore is our CEO." The words hit Ethan like cold water. CEO, Chief Executive Officer, of a company important enough to send executive assistants searching for missing bosses across half the state. "I think there might be some confusion," Ethan said carefully. "The Savannah we know is she's been helping us with a carburetor restoration project." David June's expression shifted from impatience to something approaching confusion. "Ma'am, I can assure you there's no confusion. Savannah Moore is the chief executive officer of one of the fastest growing renewable energy companies in the country. She was supposed to close a major solar infrastructure deal in Phoenix this week, but instead she's apparently been." He gestured vaguely at the garage, working on car parts. Tyler tugged on Ethan's sleeve. "Dad, the folder." "Of course." The manila folder that had been sitting on their workbench for 3 days suddenly took on an entirely different significance. Ethan retrieved it, noting for the first time the corporate logo printed discreetly in the corner, the same logo that appeared on David Chun's business card. "She left this behind," Ethan said, handing over the folder with hands that were suddenly unsteady. David Chen opened the folder and quickly scanned its contents, his expression growing more concerned with each page. These are the Phoenix contract documents. She's supposed to present these tomorrow morning to the Arizona Public Service Commission. After David Chun left with the folder and a promise to locate his missing CEO, Ethan stood in the sudden quiet of his garage, trying to process what he'd just learned. Savannah Moore wasn't just someone with money, she was someone with the kind of power and influence that moved markets and shaped policy. Why didn't she tell us? Tyler asked, voicing the question that was eating at Ethan's composure. I don't know, buddy. Maybe she had her reasons. But even as he said it, Ethan was remembering all the small moments that suddenly made sense in an entirely different context. The way Savannah had examined his improvised repair techniques with such focused attention. Her questions about his business model, his customer base, his plans for the future. The expensive coffee and magazines she'd brought, presented as casual gestures but probably costing more than some of his customers spent on groceries in a week. She'd been studying him, evaluating him. For what purpose, he couldn't begin to guess, but the realization that their relationship had been built on deception left him feeling hollow and foolish. Savannah's BMW appeared in his lot that afternoon, rolling to a stop with the quiet precision of German engineering. But when she emerged from the driver's seat, she looked different, somehow older, more tired, wearing the kind of professional clothes that suggested she'd been having difficult conversations with important people. I suppose you know by now, she said without preamble, approaching the garage with the careful gait of someone walking through a minefield. Your assistant came by looking for you, Ethan replied, his voice carefully neutral. Seemed pretty concerned about some missing CEO. Savannah nodded, her expression resignation mixed with something that might have been relief. I'm sorry, Ethan. I should have told you from the beginning who I was. Why didn't you? Because the moment people hear CEO or billionaire, everything changes. They start seeing dollar signs instead of people. They start calculating what they can get from you instead of just ... being themselves. Savannah's voice was tired, carrying the weight of someone who'd learned these lessons through experience. I wanted to know who you really were, not who you'd try to be if you thought it might benefit you financially. Tyler had been listening from his corner perch, his sketchpad forgotten in his lap. So you were testing us? Not testing, exactly. More like ... trying to understand. Savannah knelt down to Tyler's level, her expression earnest. My company works with renewable energy, solar panels, wind farms, that kind of thing. We're always looking for communities where we can make a real difference, places where our investment would actually help people rather than just generating profits for shareholders. And you thought Copper Creek might be one of those places? Ethan asked. I thought Copper Creek might be exactly the kind of place my grandfather would have wanted me to help, Savannah replied, standing to face him directly. A community built around honest work and taking care of each other, struggling not because people aren't trying hard enough, but because the economics have shifted in ways that make it harder for small businesses to survive. Ethan felt something cold settling in his stomach. So this whole thing, the carburetor restoration, the conversations about your grandfather, all of it, that was just research for some kind of corporate investment project. No, Savannah said firmly. Everything I told you about my grandfather was true. The carburetor restoration mattered to me personally, not professionally. And the conversations we've had, those were real, Ethan. The most real conversations I've had with anyone in years. But you still lied to me. You let me think you were just someone passing through town, someone interested in cars and good workmanship. You never mentioned that. You were evaluating me and my business like some kind of investment opportunity. Savannah was quiet for a long moment, and when she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. You're right. I should have been honest from the beginning. I should have told you who I was and why I was really here. Which was what exactly? To find a place where I could make a difference that would have made my grandfather proud. To find people who shared his values and deserved the kind of support that money can provide when it's used thoughtfully. Savannah met his eyes. 2. Find someone like you, Ethan. Someone who chooses integrity over profit, who treats people with dignity regardless of what they can afford to pay, who's raising a son to see beauty in honest work. Tyler looked up from his corner. Are you going to help us save the garage? The question hung in the air between them like a bridge that neither adult was quite ready to cross. Ethan wanted to say yes, wanted to accept whatever help Savannah might offer, wanted to believe that this could be the answer to all his problems. But he also felt the sting of deception, the knowledge that their entire relationship had been built on her decision to withhold crucial information about who she was and why she'd really come to Copper Creek. I don't know, Ethan said finally. I need some time to think about all this. Savannah nodded, her expression understanding but disappointed. I'll be at the hotel in town for the next few days. When you're ready to talk, really talk, with everything on the table, just call. After she left, Ethan and Tyler stood in the gathering dusk of their garage, surrounded by the tools and memories that defined their life together. The eviction notice was still crumpled in Ethan's pocket. The bills were still stacked on his desk, and the future was still uncertain. But now there was also the possibility of salvation, offered by someone who had the resources to solve all their problems but had chosen deception over honesty as her initial approach. Dad, Tyler's voice was small in the evening quiet. Yeah, buddy? Do you think she really cares about us? Or do you think we're just another business project? It was the question that would keep Ethan awake that night, staring at the ceiling and trying to figure out whether the woman who had shared his workbench and appreciated his tools was the real Savannah Moore, or whether that had been just another kind of performance designed to achieve corporate objectives he couldn't begin to understand. Sleep eluded Ethan that night, like oil sliding off a clean engine block. He lay in the narrow bed he'd shared with Sarah, staring at ceiling stains that mapped out familiar territories of worry and loss, while his mind churned through everything he thought he'd known about Savannah Moore and everything he'd just discovered about her true identity. A billionaire CEO, someone who probably spent more on business lunches than he made in a month. Someone with the power to write checks that could solve all his problems without even noticing the dent in her bank account. Someone who had looked him in the eye, shared his tools, eaten sandwiches with his son, and never once mentioned that she controlled resources that could transform his life. Tyler's breathing was steady from the next room, the deep sleep of a 9-year-old who hadn't yet learned that the world was full of people who weren't what they seemed. Ethan envied his son's ability to trust, even as he worried about protecting that innocence in a world that seemed designed to exploit it. The next morning brought no clarity, only the familiar routine of opening the garage and trying to focus on work while his mind wrestled with impossible questions. Mrs. Patterson's ancient Buick needed new brake pads, and Ethan threw himself into the repair with the desperate intensity of someone trying to find solid ground in mechanical certainties. Tyler sat in his usual corner, but his sketchpad remained unopened in his lap. Instead, he was staring out toward the road with the watchful expression of someone waiting for something important to happen. She's not coming back today, buddy, Ethan said gently, though he wasn't entirely sure that was true. And even if she does, things are complicated now. Complicated how? Tyler asked, though his tone suggested he already understood more than a 9-year-old should have to. When people have a lot of money, sometimes it's hard to know why they're really being nice to you. Are they helping because they care about you, or because they want something from you? Ethan set down his wrench and looked directly at his son. And when someone doesn't tell you important things about themselves, it makes you wonder what else they might not be telling you. Tyler considered this with the serious expression he wore when processing adult concepts that didn't fit neatly into his understanding of how the world was supposed to work. But she fixed the carburetor with us, Tyler said finally. She got her hands dirty and learned all the parts and drew pictures with me. Rich people who don't really care about cars wouldn't do that, would they? It was a fair point, and one that had been nagging at Ethan since yesterday's revelation. Savannah's enthusiasm for the restoration project had seemed genuine, her attention to detail authentic, her questions intelligent and engaged. Those weren't the behaviors of someone simply going through the motions to achieve some corporate objective. Maybe not, Ethan admitted. But that doesn't change the fact that she lied to us about who she was. Did she lie, or did she just not tell us everything? The distinction mattered more than Ethan wanted to admit. Thinking back through their conversations, he couldn't identify any specific moment when Savannah had said something false. She'd talked about business consulting, which was technically accurate even if it was incomplete. She'd mentioned having other responsibilities, which was certainly true for a CEO. She'd shared stories about her grandfather that had felt genuine and personal, but she'd also allowed them to form assumptions about her circumstances that were wildly inaccurate. She'd let them believe she was just another customer, just another person passing through their small town, when in reality she was someone with the power to reshape their entire future. The morning brought a steady stream of customers, each with their own automotive problems and their own stories. Old Pete needed his transmission fluid changed. The Rodriguez family's minivan was making strange noises that turned out to be a loose heat shield. A young mother whose Honda had been running rough discovered she'd been sold contaminated gas at a station 2 towns over. Each repair was a small victory, a problem solved through patience and skill, and the kind of creative problem-solving that had kept Ethan's business alive despite increasingly difficult circumstances. But today, even successful repairs felt hollow somehow, overshadowed by the knowledge that all his efforts might be meaningless in the face of economic realities he couldn't control. Just after lunch, Savannah's BMW appeared again, rolling into the lot with the quiet authority of expensive engineering. But this time, she wasn't alone. The passenger seat held a man in a business suit who stepped out of the car with the confident posture of someone accustomed to being important. "Ethan," Savannah approached the garage with obvious hesitation, "I'd like you to meet James Wilson, our Director of Community Development. I asked him to come because I thought you might have questions about how these kinds of partnerships typically work." James Wilson extended a hand and a business card simultaneously, his smile carrying the practiced warmth of someone who specialized in making deals happen. "Mr. White, it's a pleasure to meet you. Savannah has told me amazing things about your operation here." Ethan accepted the handshake warily, noting the man's soft hands and expensive watch. This was someone who lived in conference rooms and spreadsheets, someone who probably hadn't worked with actual tools since high school shop class. "What kind of partnership are we talking about?" Ethan asked, though part of him already knew he wasn't going to like the answer. James Wilson launched into what was clearly a practiced presentation about community investment initiatives, sustainable development projects, and the importance of preserving local businesses while upgrading their infrastructure to meet modern environmental standards. It was the kind of corporate speak that used a lot of impressive words to avoid saying anything concrete. "What Mr. Wilson is trying to explain," Savannah interrupted, clearly frustrated with the presentation, "is that my company would like to help you expand and modernize your garage while keeping everything that makes it special." "Expand how?" Tyler asked, looking up from his sketchpad with sharp interest. James Wilson smiled at Tyler with the condescending expression adults often reserve for children asking inconvenient questions. "Well, young man, we'd probably start with solar panels for the roof, energy-efficient lighting, maybe some upgraded diagnostic equipment. Then we could look at expanding the building itself, adding service bays, perhaps even a small retail component." "And in exchange?" Ethan asked, though he suspected he already knew. "In exchange, your garage becomes a showcase for sustainable business practices in rural communities, Wilson explained. We document the process, share the results with other communities facing similar challenges, and demonstrate that environmental responsibility and economic viability can work together. Tyler set down his pencil and looked directly at James Wilson. So you'd turn our garage into an advertisement for your company? The directness of the question clearly caught Wilson off guard. It's more of a partnership than an advertisement, he said carefully. Everyone benefits. Who decides what changes get made? Ethan asked. Well, we'd work together to develop a plan that meets everyone's needs, Wilson replied, but his tone suggested that working together would involve a lot more input from Horizon Renewable Energy than from White's Auto Repair. Ethan looked at Savannah, trying to read her expression. She seemed uncomfortable with Wilson's presentation, occasionally wincing at his word choices or shaking her head at his explanations. But she'd brought him here, which suggested she supported his approach even if she didn't entirely like his delivery. I need to think about this, Ethan said finally. Of course, Wilson replied, producing a thick folder from his briefcase. Here are some preliminary proposals and examples of similar projects we've completed. Take your time, look everything over, and we can schedule another meeting when you're ready to move forward. After they left, Ethan and Tyler sat in the garage surrounded by the familiar smell of motor oil and the comforting presence of tools that had been serving faithfully for decades. The folder from Horizon Renewable Energy lay unopened on the workbench, its corporate logo somehow ominous in the afternoon light. What do you think, Dad? Tyler asked. I think, Ethan said slowly, that when someone offers to solve all your problems, you should probably ask yourself what problems you might be creating for them to solve. Tyler nodded solemnly. Do you think Savannah really wants to help us, or does she just want to use us to make her company look good? It was the question that had been haunting Ethan since yesterday's revelation. The woman who had worked alongside him on the carburetor restoration, who had shared personal stories about her grandfather, who had treated Tyler with genuine respect and interest, that woman had seemed real and authentic. But the CEO who sent corporate development directors with prepared presentations and thick folders of legal documents felt like someone else entirely. I don't know, Ethan admitted. And that's the problem. When you can't tell the difference between someone who wants to help you and someone who wants to use you, it's probably safer to assume the worst. That evening, as they closed up the garage and climbed the stairs to their small apartment, Tyler paused at the window that looked out over their parking lot. Dad, he said quietly, what if we just said no? What if we told them we want to keep the garage exactly the way it is? Then we'd probably lose it anyway when the bank forecloses, Ethan replied, the words tasting bitter in his mouth. At least. This way, there's a chance we could keep working on cars, even if everything else changes. But would it still be our garage? It was a question that Ethan couldn't answer because he wasn't sure he understood what ours would mean in a partnership. With Horizon Renewable Energy, would he still be able to charge fair prices to customers who couldn't afford to pay full market rates? Would he still be able to take on the kind of challenging repairs that bigger shops avoided? Would Tyler still be able to spend his afternoons learning about engines and drawing mechanical systems? Or would they become employees in their own business, following corporate guidelines and meeting performance metrics determined by people who had never worked with rusty tools or struggled to make rent? Outside their window, Copper Creek settled into its evening quiet, the kind of peace that came from being far enough from anywhere important that the rest of the world mostly forgot you existed. It was a good life, Ethan thought, even if it wasn't an easy one. The question was whether accepting Savannah's help would preserve that life or transform it into something unrecognizable. And underneath all his other worries was the deeper question of whether he could ever trust someone who had the power to change his world with a single phone call, especially someone who had already proven that she was comfortable keeping secrets when it served her purposes. Tomorrow would bring more difficult decisions and impossible choices. But tonight, he just wanted to sit with his son and hold on to the life they built together. However precarious it might be, the answer came to Ethan at 3 in the morning. Not from corporate folders or sleepless worry, but from Tyler's quiet voice in the darkness. "Dad?" Tyler's whisper carried across their small apartment. "I can't sleep." Ethan found his son sitting at the kitchen table, surrounded by his sketches from the carburetor restoration. In the dim light, Tyler had been studying each drawing like they held secrets he was trying to decode. "What's on your mind, buddy?" "I keep thinking about what Savannah said, about her grandfather wanting her to help people who share his values." Tyler looked up with eyes that seemed older than 9 years should allow. What if she's telling the truth? What if she really does want to help us the right way? Ethan sat down beside his son, studying the detailed drawings that captured every stage of their work together. "What makes you think that?" "Because look," Tyler pointed to a sketch showing Savannah's hands, carefully positioning a gasket. "She didn't have to learn all the parts. She didn't have to get her hands dirty or ask so many questions. If she was just pretending to care, she would have just watched and said nice things." The simple logic cut through all of Ethan's complicated fears. Tyler was right. Authentic interest couldn't be faked, not for hours of detailed mechanical work. "But what about her not telling us who she really was?" Ethan asked. Tyler shrugged with 9-year-old wisdom. "Maybe she was scared we'd act different. If we knew, rich people probably have lots of people pretending to like them just for their money." At dawn, Ethan called Savannah's number. When she answered, her voice was tired but hopeful. "I want to talk," he said simply. "But not with corporate development directors or presentation folders. Just you, me, and Tyler. And I want to set some ground rules about what help looks like. If we're going to do this." "Name them," Savannah replied without hesitation. "We stay small enough that I know every customer's name. We keep prices fair for people who can't afford them. And Tyler gets to be part of every decision that affects our garage." There was a long pause before Savannah spoke, and when she did, her voice carried the warmth he remembered from their carburetor restoration sessions. "Those sound exactly like the rules my grandfather would have made." 6 months later, White's Auto Repair hummed with the kind of purposeful energy that comes from dreams taking solid form. The solar panels on the roof caught the morning sun like promises kept, while inside the expanded bays, a steady stream of customers waited in chairs that somehow managed to be both comfortable and practical. Tyler, now 10 and wearing a junior mechanic shirt with his name embroidered on the pocket, led a group of local teenagers through their weekly automotive basics class. His teaching style mixed technical precision with the patient enthusiasm he'd learned from watching his father work with difficult repairs. "Remember," Tyler explained to a girl struggling with a socket wrench, "tools aren't about forcing things. They're about understanding what needs to happen and helping it happen smoothly." Ethan looked up from the hybrid engine he was diagnosing, skill he'd learned through the training program Savannah's company had funded, and smiled at the sound of his son passing on lessons that had traveled from grandfather to father to son and now to an entire community of young people. The garage had kept every promise they'd made to each other. Prices remained fair, customers were still neighbors first and revenue sources second. And the soul of the place, that indefinable quality that made people feel heard and valued, had somehow grown stronger, rather than weaker. Savannah appeared. In the doorway, no longer disguised as just another customer, but wearing work clothes that showed she'd been spending time in the expanded community workshop where locals could learn to maintain their own vehicles. "How's the new diagnostic equipment working out?" she asked, joining Ethan at the hybrid. "Like having superpowers," Ethan replied with a grin. Though Tyler still insists that listening to the engine tells you more than any computer. Through the window, They could see the sign that now hung beside the original weathered White's Auto Repair marker, Community Automotive Center, where every car matters. Below it, in Tyler's careful handwriting, were the words that had become their unofficial motto: fixing more than engines, building more than business. Sarah would have been proud. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.